Good evening, everybody. Welcome. My name is Pat Hubble, and I'm Candorful's co-founder and executive director. Thank you so much for joining us tonight to honor Veterans Day 2024. We have a great event ahead. Bear with me for a few seconds while I tell you a little bit about Candorful and the work we do. We are a 501c3 nonprofit using an innovative approach to provide job interview and networking prep for transitioning military, veterans, and military spouses. Since launching in 2018, we have supported over 4,000 military job candidates with the help of 130 amazing volunteer interview coaches from sponsoring companies. This support is essential for keeping military families strong and resilient. I'd like to take a moment to thank our awesome volunteer interview coaches, many of whom are veterans themselves or from military families. You guys rock. Let's also take a minute to thank our veterans, that's why we're here, and their families for their service. So thank you so much. We are grateful for the sacrifice and the service you have done on our behalf. Awesome. If you're excited about Candorful and what we do, and I hope you are, you can help by donating. We'll be dropping the donation link in the chat throughout our event. Your support makes our impact possible. We really need you. Thank you to our awesome sponsors who have helped us bring this Veterans Day event to you. First of all, our platinum sponsor, Booz Allen Hamilton, our silver sponsors, Groundswell and Exiger, and our continuing contributor, Amazon. Now, keep alert. We have 3 trivia questions coming at you throughout the event, so listen up. Whoever answers the question first via chat, not Q&A, but via chat, will get a cool Candorful Yeti mug. There it is, right? It's really cool. So be speedy and then chat, and I get to make the decision about who wins. I'm really excited by our panelists tonight. They represent top players in the supply chain industry, whole lot of experience represented here, together 84 years on our panel. Before we introduce the panel, though, I'd like to introduce our guest moderator, Skyler Chi, Senior Vice President and Global Head of Pre-Sales and Innovation at Exiger. Skyler, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Great. I'm very excited to be here, Pat. Thank you for hosting all of us this evening, and thank the nearly 80 attendees to tonight's discussion as well for your time. I really love the conversation that we're going to have tonight around supply chain and supply chain security. As head of innovation at Exiger, my role for roughly the past decade has centered around exploring new technologies and approaches, various methodologies of how we can anticipate and detect and respond to risks across our end-to-end supply chains to multiple tiers. Innovation doesn't always mean the development of new tools or systems. Much like the panelists that we'll hear from tonight, innovation also thinks about how we may rethink collaboration, how we may ultimately understand vulnerabilities across our end-to-end supply chain ecosystems with the experts like those that are on the line in increasingly complex and very much interconnected ecosystems and landscapes globally. I'm looking forward to digging into some of the topics tonight, which include geopolitical instability, cyber threats, very challenging and complicated regulatory changes globally, and ultimately more efficient ways of how we may manage risks to ensure that we have very resilient and very agile supply chains. And so I'd like to start by introducing our 3 panelists. On the line tonight, we have Brian Memoli, who is the Vice President of Supply Chain Operations at Gemaire Distributors, based in Florida here in the United States. I'm based in New York. We have Eric Topp, who is the worldwide head of AWS Transportation and Logistics Solutions and Strategy. And lastly, we have Jennifer Nestor from Exiger, who's the Senior Vice President of the Defense Industrial-based practice, who looks to harden using supply chain risk management tools, some of our supply chain resiliency here at Exiger. I'd like to take a few moments if we could have each one of our panelists introduce themselves as well, starting with Brian Memoli.
Hey, good evening, everyone. I'm honored to be on this panel and speaking with you tonight, and I'm really looking forward to some great discussions with the entire team. Thanks to the Candorful team for hosting this wonderful event. As Skyler said, I'm Brian Memoli, and for the past 7 months, I've been in my new position as the VP of Supply Chain and Operations for Gemaire. Before that, I was an active duty Army officer for about 30 years, specializing obviously in logistics, the topic of the day. And that varied from warehouse operations to fleet maintenance, strategic distribution. And my experience over the 30 years runs everything from the tactical level to the operational and the sustainment level, or through the strategic level of sustainment, really. I've worked supply chain and logistics support in the US, the Middle East, Africa, Europe, Central America. Done a little bit or a lot, done a lot, but I did a little bit of everything. If you say the word supply chain, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from the experts today. So I'll pass it back over to you, Scott.
Great. Thanks, Brian. Eric, would love to hear a little bit about your role at AWS and ultimately what supply chain means to you as well.
Sure. Hey, everyone. My name's Eric Top. I wear two hats. I head up solution development when it comes to transportation and logistics globally for AWS. And I also work on the AWS supply chain team, which is a new product. I've got about 32 years in the industry and from various positions. My career has tended to vacillate on two pillars, back and forth between operations and IT, as well as public sector and commercial sector. My officer basic was in 1192, and my officer advanced was in 396. And I was also a GS employee, so I was with the government for about 10 years. So excited to be here and share whatever we can to help folks.
Thanks, Eric. Jen, last, certainly not least, if you'd like to take a few seconds to introduce yourself and what supply chain means to you.
Absolutely. Good evening. Happy early Veterans Day. Thank you so much for having us today and for making the time. Thank you for all the veterans and your families for your service and your sacrifice over the years. So a little bit about my background. I started out my career, I went to the Air Force Academy and luckily graduated. Upon graduation, I went straight into Air Force Office of Special Investigations, so doing federal level investigations. And really, I've spent the last 20 plus years in support of defense and aerospace missions, intelligence, running ethics and compliance programs, and really over the last handful of years, really using technology to support supply chain risk management. So at Exiger, I lead our defense industrial based programs. And what we do is we use our SaaS, artificial intelligence. We bring big data sets to our clients to provide the most holistic site picture on the entities, suppliers, parts and materials in their supply chain so that they really can map their entire supply chain ecosystem. All the skills I gained in the military from crisis management, investigations, intelligence, incident response, there's so many different things, training, preparing a plan, right, executing upon it. All those things have really had a huge impact on my career and what I've done and supported me to take on many different roles. So thanks again for joining. I look forward to the discussion.
Great. Thanks, Jen. And to the panelists, happy Veterans Day to you as well. And thank all three of you for your collective service. I think let's jump right into it. I find it fascinating that since the start, particularly of COVID, supply chain has become almost a nightly dinner table based discussion. And it means so many different things to so many different people, whether procurement or the infrastructure that sustains global supply chain like that, Eric, that you're building, or the security that allows it to be secure from foreign adversarial threats. And so perhaps, Eric, I can start with you to ask a little bit about how your military experience and background ultimately shaped your approach to supply chain challenges in the private sector.
Absolutely. I kind of came from a strange background. Before I got involved with the military, I was a collegiate athlete and I was a swimmer. And I swam for the University of Tennessee. And I remember one guy told me a story once. He had a joke and he said that he had a choice of joining the military or going to do Tennessee swimming, and it probably would have been easier to join the military than it would have been, where we ended up. But so I came from a very structured, very rigorous environment, and and then I went to work for the military, which was, I like to say I thought it was a pretty good fit at the time, but a lot of the challenges making the transition over from the commercial space or from the military space or a structured space like that into the commercial sector is really trying to understand some of the, I hate to say, some of the differences and the similarities. So for example, when you look at making a transition, you'll look at like what the values, what the culture, Everyone's focused on results, but it's, how do I say this? It's less of being able to order somebody to do something and more being focused on being able to persuade and, and make your case and, understanding how to work with others, within an organization when you basically make that transition, because in the commercial space, obviously, it's a bit different. There are many shared goals in the sense of your performance, your outcome, metrics and things like that. But the cultural environment for how to do things is very different. So I almost think like, you kind of have to have like different switches that you will, look at for switching like what works. So I guess the best way to put it is you kind of need to be able to bring over the best and amazing elements that come from working with the military, but then you also have to turn off some of the other things that may not necessarily make you successful, in working in a commercial environment, because you're going from a very structured organization in many cases to a matrixed organization where, it's about winning influence and learning how to work with people. So, I have a running joke. I have a lot of running jokes, but one of them is with Amazon. Working for Amazon's like working for a company with 10,000 startups. And so when you're working in that type of environment, when one of the things I always tell people is anytime you talk to another an Amazonian, the first question out of your mouth should be, after you get to know them, is what are your metrics? Because everyone is very metrics driven, and that'll determine how you will work together to be able to accomplish a shared task. Whereas in the military, everybody's got the common goal of, we're going to get the job done no matter what. I have a plan A, I have a plan B, I have a plan C. And so I think it's kind of like a happy balance in many cases to be successful, once again, of bringing over those things, like I've said before, that make you very successful in the military space, but then kind of modifying your approach so that it's more applicable in the commercial sector.
I would imagine that in the public sector, and particularly in more structured environments like the military, there's always a need, similar to supply chains, of having a plan A, having a plan B, and having a plan C. Are those lessons able to be transitioned and be especially useful in your current role, being nimble but having a plan?
Absolutely. Even if it goes down to the old joke, from the Battle of the Bulge, where the Germans got a hold of the Americans' plans, and the young lieutenant comes in and he says, "We've got the Americans' plans," and the German general goes, "The Americans never follow any of their plans." So it's like Mike Tyson. Mike Tyson has a great quote, everyone's heard, that says, everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face. So absolutely, you have a plan, but you also have to have the adaptability to then adjust when you get hit with things that make your plan, untenable to actually be able to execute.
Brian, I see you nodding in various ways of agreement. How do you think that applies to operations?
Yeah, and so that was a perfect segue, actually, into some of the things I had to say. So I kind of have two examples where my thoughts in my head were the military, and one's from very, very young age as a lieutenant, and then the other one would be from when I was more senior, about how things that I learned in the military are applicable today to my job at Gemaire. One of my very first duty assignments were in the 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment and the 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment. And those guys are way out front, operating ahead of everybody. And I was doing their logistics support. And my boss at the time, we would plan a training, a training mission. And we would go out and we'd recon it, and we would plan it, and we would come back and we would make plans. And then you would lead your convoy, and halfway out, you'd get a radio call from him that said, "Hey, the location and the duration has changed. You now need to be 7 miles away, and you're going to be there for 6 days. Effective right now. That's your new orders." Right? And so I would get out of my vehicle and lay my map down on the hood and figure out where the new place was, and then brief my team. And I really learned to work in an ambiguity and how to operate on the fly, right? You had to, not that you were flying by the seat of your pants, because all those procedures you had put in place before still applied, but you needed to be able to apply them in a different location or in a different manner. And so that flexibility that Eric was just talking about is probably one of the pivotal things I learned in one of my very first duty assignments in the Army. Was, you know, how to pivot, how to have a plan, how to change from that plan and work in that ambiguity, but still make decisions and still lead other folks to follow those procedures and set things up. So I can completely appreciate where Eric was coming from. And then the second one, really, as a more senior officer, and this gets into a little bit of the relationship building that Eric was talking about also. You know, you learn to trust your subject matter experts. The higher up you go in the Army, eventually people start working for you where you don't know anything about what they do. I mean, you know what the result is of what they do, but you couldn't possibly do it, right? And so you get comfortable with trusting your subject matter experts. And my job at Gemaire, I have some direct subordinates that are by far way more versed in air conditioning, way more versed in our plans and how we operate and how we do our logistics. I've got the big picture, but my job is to take their subject matter expertise and roll it into where the boss's priorities are in getting things done. And knowing where they fit into that and helping them fit into the bigger plan for the greater organization. And so, you know, I learned that as I grew up through the ranks, and certainly as I was much more senior and had a bigger span of control. I had tons of people that, you know, literally were far better subject matter experts than I ever was. My job was to point them in the right direction and then trust that they were doing the right thing. And that is absolutely applicable today to my job. So
thanks, Brian. It's always surprised me on how limited information we have against our supply chains, given how structured supply chain teams tend to be. When you look across organograms, there are typically analysts and manager level roles, all the way up to vice presidents of procurement and chief supply chain officers that today ultimately have a seat on executive committees of large manufacturing companies. I think it was about 2 years ago, the Pentagon had to halt deliveries of the F-35. Honeywell-made turbo machines, a component of the engines that were on F-35s, were found to have Chinese magnets that were instrumental in the design and configuration of those turbo machines. And it was a multi-billion-dollar mistake, even with that structure, even with the subject matter experts that ultimately sat within Lockheed Martin, one of what I think we would all agree to be one of the most well-structured and stringent supply chains in the world. Jen, given your experience inside of supply chain risk management in the context you have through your national security background, what exactly does supply chain risk management mean and national security mean inside of today's supply chain? How have geopolitical events generally perhaps impacted your perspective of how we structure organizations around procurement today?
Sure. So I would love to start by chatting about the periodic table and critical minerals, something I never thought I would say. Over the last several years, we've seen the periodic table being weaponized by the CCP, right? We know that China maintains dominance over global processing of many critical minerals, everything from germanium, gallium, graphite, antimony, rare earth elements, right? There are dozens of critical minerals that we're relying upon, not only the US, but our allies, right? And broadly across industries, from aerospace and defense, energy, electronic, automotive, right? Just to name a few. So really, as a country and our allies, right, there's so many materials that we rely on. So when you talk about what is material security, what is supply chain risk management. That target is a lot different now than what it was in the past. And I think COVID, shined a really bright light on that. We have to go beyond the tier ones, right? And going back to the example of critical minerals, right? A lot of times it's not apparent what parts leverage that. So you have to know the materials, the parts, the specifications, and even the special processing. So, to focus on national security, to focus on material security and what supply chain risk management means, it's mapping beyond that tier one. It's going deep into your supply chain, and companies, government, we know that tier one relationship, right? We know the entities that we have contracts with. So when you go past that contract privity, when you go beyond that relationship that you typically manage, that's information that you don't typically have in-house. And that's where I think tech, supply chain risk management platforms and artificial intelligence, it's allowing us to daisy chain big data in a way where we can track and trace the import and export records. We can bring in contractual relationships. We can use open source media, right? We know our adversaries, criminals, even our allies are using open source media to shape economic, strategic, national military measures. And so for me, supply chain risk management, again, it's if we're not using big data, real-time data to map that supply chain, to vet, to monitor, to risk assess, to do criticality assessment, to engage at those various tiers, to look at that aggregate demand. If we're not doing that, we don't really have security over our supply chains. I don't know if I totally answered your question there. Geopolitical events,
it's fascinating. I think that there's an understanding that supply chain is buyers and sellers globally, and a lot of it is around contracting and making sure that there are certain specifications that are being met around contracting. But it sounds like technology and big tech is particularly important in today's supply chain world.
Absolutely, right. There's such rich data that's housed, right? The government has such rich data, right? Companies, right? You vet, right? You gather information, you gather attestations, you do your own due diligence. But beyond those specific contractual relationships, there's just such a vast amount of data that now we can aggregate and we can map with great fidelity. And I don't know that I touched on your question about geopolitical events, but the last handful of years have made it crystal clear. We have indications now that world events, and we always have, right? We have indications that things are happening. And the first question, right, when we knew a hurricane was coming or an event was happening, right, the procurement team gets asked, what are the impacts? What's the impact to my my schedule? What's the impact to materials? How am I going to continue to deliver? What does this mean for us? And at that point in time, if you haven't mapped your supply chain, if you don't have that big data at your hands, if you don't have that real-time data, it's too late, right? You can't answer those questions. You can't just magically bring that data in and kind of aggregate it with the site picture that you have internally.
I can only imagine, Eric, before we jump into a quick trivia question, the vast trove of data you and Amazon must have to make the most strategically successful supply chains globally.
Well, yeah, and we do. We leverage a lot of data, but we don't take people out of the decision process because, AI is a wonderful thing, and we could spend 3 hours just talking about AI and the pros and the cons and what works and what doesn't. But Skynet is not here for simplistic terms. And when we even within Amazon, we still have people look at things because machines have not seen everything. And the example I always use is we were doing labor planning at one of the warehouses, and I had a friend of mine that was the warehouse manager, and like the All-Stars game ran long that year. And the labor planning model said that everything was going to be fine. And the warehouse manager took one look at the labor planning model and said, well, there's an All-Stars game that's running long. So that means everyone's going to call in sick tomorrow. And he, like I said, so he took one look at that and like red penned it. So, we try to balance, where you'll see, Gen AI making decisions today is more geared towards what I would say is like tactical things. It's not the strategic things. We still have people looking at them. Now, where it comes valuable is being able to do a lot of the what if type scenario plays that are out there with digital twin and a lot of the other plays. And then to bounce back a little bit to Jennifer, I worked for Bolloré for 6 years in Africa. And, part of the challenge we've had as a country, just in general, is that China's been willing to get in and get dirty in a lot of places that we've not been willing to get into. So, you don't see a whole lot of American companies in Kinshasa, DRC, going after cobalt or lithium or where, so I think in many cases, one, it's the appetite for risk of a lot of the commercial companies, and it's playing the long game versus playing the short game in many cases. So kind of to link the two together, two things. One, I think we need to start looking more strategically across the geopolitical spectrum when it comes to supplies and raw materials. And where we really shine then is leveraging a lot of the newer technologies to enable us to be more strategic in our decision making and be more effective and efficient in our operations.
It's a great segue into trivia question number one. I wish I could have said I planted this, but as it's specific to raw materials, resources, and roads, trivia question number one for those on the line. And remember, there are trivia rewards for getting these right. What competitive board game launched in Germany in 1995 requires players to think through basic supply chain concepts like roads and resources and has sold over 40 million games since 1995? Looks like we have some answers rolling into the chat. So Pat will be determining who is the winner of each trivia question through something as simple as looking at the chat instead of using AI, which may be able to time it a bit better. But Eric, coming back to the strategy of natural resources today, I think that we see China's efforts through their Belt and Road initiatives as they continuously invest into Africa. And you mentioned cobalt, lithium, are others, rare earth elements like neodymium that are just so critical in powering much of what allows our Western world to run today. I really see that as one incredibly strategic risk, perhaps nearshoring or onshoring some of our domestic mining capability. What other risks from a strategic standpoint do you think are facing more broadly supply chains today? How do you prioritize them? I think as I turn Bloomberg on every morning, it is supply chain risk after supply chain risk after supply chain risk. There are port strikes that are seizing up global shipping. There's foreign adversaries that are taking control of mining. Where do you start?
Well, I think there's a balance between back to your point, between the raw materials. There's a balance between the technology. I also joke that there's a balance between the media, because it seems lately that a lot of people, they'll put on the media, how do I say this without getting myself in too much trouble? Basically, post-COVID, there are a lot of supply chain experts that I didn't know there were so many supply chain experts on the planet until COVID hit. And all of a sudden there's a lot of them, but the balance is just like anything, back to the military, there's people that talk about doing things and there's people that have actually done them, as we get to the point about been there, done that, got the t-shirt. So when you start looking across the spectrum of the providers, the partners, and things that are out there, really what we see, and I say we, I'm speaking personally, not for the company, but one of the biggest challenges I see just from like normal companies managing their supply chains is data. Everyone has data. They've got tons of data. What they don't have is actionable information. And so it's converting all the data that they have into something that is usable, that is normalized. So before I joined AWS, I used to work for a quasi startup, and we made a warehouse visibility tool that was amazing. And we used to normalize all the warehouse management systems on the data because, like, for example, in Kerber, they call this a pen. In Blue Yonder, they call it a stylus. In SAP, they call it a crayon. And so now you're trying to normalize data across a bunch of different systems so that you can start looking at things, start doing forecasting, start doing projection. And you really can't do that until you've been able to normalize, cleanse, and harmonize the data. Because I had a stats professor at Penn State a lifetime ago when we used to do everything in Excel, although there are still a ton of companies that are doing things in Excel. And he used to say, computer very dumb. So, and his point behind that was it'll give you an answer, but if your data is terrible or wrong, it'll give you a wrong answer, but it'll still give you an answer. And the same is true with generative AI today. You can get an answer, but with the, hallucinations and a lot of other things that go on with the data, it doesn't mean that your answer is right. So step one is all about building your foundation and getting your plumbing right when it comes to your data, because all the rest of it almost becomes a moot point until you do that these days. Because what we've really seen over the last 10 years or so is really a shift from a primary focus on a physical supply chain to a virtual and a digital supply chain, which is really being driven by, technology and data.
I started my career as a forensic accountant, and we did our best to build models at the time in Excel and in Python, and garbage in, garbage out was at the heart of everything we did. Even from an accounting perspective, human-based analysts and accountants had a propensity to fat finger when they may be manually reviewing receipts. And I'm sure the same holds true with big data lakes of, for example, when we need to map our supply chains down to the dirt in the ground. I mean, Jen, from your perspective, from a strategic standpoint, how do we address some of those risks of data cleanliness? China, for example, doesn't share data with the rest of the world. So when we rely on China as a bastion of manufacturing resource today, and they refuse to share any information, how do we penetrate some of that veil that's put up by our largest trading partner?
Yeah, good question. I think there's a bottoms up approach, right? Starting from the parts, the bill of materials, and a top down approach. And I think the ability to, again, when you're talking about big data, there's lots of different data sources that you can bring in to map those relationships, to search for indications. There's ability to extract information within seconds on drawings, right? Whether you have a bill of materials or you have technical data, or you simply have a part number, or you have a company name. So every situation is a little bit different, but I think as we look at that data, as we map those relationships, in some cases you do supplier vendor validation, right? You work with your suppliers and you take a look at it to make sure that you are bringing forward valid information. And then with the comment about just massive amounts of data, I think you absolutely have to risk assess it, right? Because there's just, like you said, there's data lakes of data, and it's just too much to triage. You need the data because there's certain data points that you have to find that needle in that haystack, because that needle's material and it's gonna drive you to make decisions. So again, I think our goal is to map the entire supply chain to understand, again, whatever material it is, what materials are critical, what suppliers are critical. Do you know your schedule? What's your aggregated demand? And I think, again, historically, we haven't gone as deep as we are going now in the supply chain to understand that and to be able to prioritize in a way that we are now, to drive more strategic decisions, again, whether that's at a specific client level, whether that's at an agency level, or whether that's at a country level, right, where we're trying to onshore, substitute suppliers, explore innovations and technology, to do different material substitutions, to ensure capacity and resilience.
Thanks, Jen. Wanted to jump in very quickly with trivia question number 2. Remember, there are prizes up for grabs. Trivia question number 2 is, who is the father of supply chain, and what company did they work for? he worked for. This is a tough one. I think I saw the right answer come in. Pat, do we have a winner of 2? Yeah. So, wanted to take a few seconds to introduce our platinum sponsor, a partner of Exiger's as well, Booz Allen Hamilton, who Keith Oliver had worked for. There's a quick 30-second video that we have from Booz Allen as one of our sponsors of tonight's event.
Wondering what the civilian world has to offer? Where you'll fit in? If you'll find the same sense of purpose the military has given you. Upskilling into a tech role can be your path to a purposeful and future-focused career. Your leadership experience, passion to serve, and mission expertise make you the perfect fit for a career in tech. We need you to help us defend against cyber attacks, use AI to beat our adversaries, and build the solutions that will enable the next generation of warfighters. Defend the future. Lead with us.
So, of course, an enormous thank you to Booz Allen for supporting such a wonderful mission from Candorful across tonight's event. I do want to come back to some of the big data conversation. And, Brian, as I look around my home, some of the most, with the exception of maybe my laptop, some of the most complex devices I have in my home are around HVAC. They're around refrigeration. They're around much of the components that are across them as well. How is it in the heart and as a leader of operations, do you use data in your executive level decision-making? How does that roll up at a board level for you in ways that are more easy to understand without, there were some questions in the chat, without scope creep? Where do you start in helping to manage supply chains?
Yeah, and that's a fantastic question, because I think I ask myself that almost every single day at work. There is data everywhere, right? And somebody earlier said, data is not information, and data is not knowledge. And data doesn't lead to decisions. Information and knowledge, coupled with some, experience and understanding, create decision making. And so, we have BI, and we spend a lot of time in BI, and we look at every facet. Whether we're looking to make our supply chain more efficient, whether on the sales end, how we're collecting revenue, where the streams cross, it is a continual topic of discussion. And there's no end to the different ways that we use this data that turns into information to try to make decisions about, better ways to support our customers, better ways to run our operations. And it's really, it's amazing to me. There are days where there's just so much data that you really have to spend time trying to make heads or tails of it to make informed decisions. And so, starting with some business intelligence and that data, and really it starts with the collection of that data and where it comes from and the reliability of it. And are you getting the right data fields to get you? Are you asking the right question, right? Sometimes you get an answer, but you're answering the wrong question. And I think all of that, and I think that can be done when there's too much data. Sometimes you can take so much data that you draw the wrong conclusion because you didn't ask the right question, or you didn't find the right thread you had to pull. And so it's an everyday occurrence, and that data is used all the way up. So, we're part of a greater company called Watsco. That's our parent company. And, they're looking at our data, we're looking at our data, and then together we're looking at how they can help us and how we can help the greater business continue to thrive and get better. And that carries operations, logistics. It's everything down to safety, right? I mean, I look at safety statistics and safety in operations, and and how we do better training. It's everywhere around us. You just have to make sure that you're answering the right question, in my opinion.
Do you start with a hypothesis and work your way back into your supply chain, or do you typically let the data tell a more compelling story itself as you pull on certain threads?
I think it's both. There are just some things that if you have 30 years doing this or 20 years doing this, your gut tells you that something's awry and you start digging. There are other times where the data comes up very clear that you missed something, or that it points you in the direction that maybe you didn't think you were needing to go in or had to go in. And so I know that's a very lawyer-like answer to be yes and both, but I really think it's true. The more time you spend in the data, the more time you start to, you find those other pieces that you were missing.
Data sounds a little boring, but I am imagining, Eric, a Mission Impossible level movie set of a command center for Amazon and AWS in your world as you bring all of these different systems and technologies together. You mentioned AI earlier. How has the rapid expansion and evolution of some of those technology systems that are ingesting that data changed, perhaps the cool factor of supply chains for such large companies like Amazon?
Yeah, I'm not so sure if it's changed the cool factor. I keep having jokes that being a logistician for many years, that great scene from, the Clancy series that they did on Amazon. I keep waiting for the helicopter to come pick me up at the cocktail party, then all of a sudden be swooped out to solve what the problem, but then answer the question, well, I work in logistics for the government or something like that, so, there's a lot of great technologies that are out there. And, it's funny because I was doing a presentation the other day and I was talking to people that were of equally somewhat long in the tooth. And, I had the discussion about, well, do you remember .com? Do you remember blockchain? Do you remember, a lot of these initiatives? And I think, with AI right now, that's a lot of where we are. There are a lot of great practical applications for AI. And what we see out there today in the technology space is it's kind of like a split. So there are great applications that are strategic, and there are great applications that are tactical. Most of the tactical applications of generative AI these days are more about, I think, aligned more to the CEO of NVIDIA when he made the comment, and I will modify it a little bit, where he said, he was asked the question, is Gen AI going to take my job? And his answer back was, no, the person that uses Gen AI is going to take your job. And it's almost the same for companies. So you see a lot of great tactical use cases for generative AI for like employee productivity. And then there's a lot of great uses on more the strategic level. So to go back to like our old mindset of strategic, operational, tactical, that's kind of the way that I look at things. So on the strategic level, there are many great things around like large data sets, routing and optimization, procurement. There's so many great use cases for generative AI these days, but I almost feel that it's gotten too much hype from a lot of the market at this point. It's not the coming of the next Messiah. There's a lot of great use cases, and you need to figure out how to use it and leverage it within your own organization. But a lot of it is about finding out what works for you based on your use case in your organization and what you're trying to do within your organization to be successful. So what I normally tell people around this is, one of the biggest challenges people have when they work on large scale projects like this is what I call the forest in the trees. They can see the forest, which is the vision of what they want to become, and everything's perfect, shining beacon on the hill, to quote, past political figures, but they can't figure out how to put the initiatives in order that's going to get them to that point. And so we get a lot of clients that are, paralysis because they just to find that first thing to do. And so normally what we tell people to do is that come back, because with Amazon, we work backwards from customers. We focus on customer problems. Tell me what your biggest problems are, and we try to work backwards from that of selecting one or two things to work on that you can start showing success and getting momentum and that have a meaningful impact to your organization. So there's a lot of great tools out there, but I always tell everyone, and like I said, it may be strange coming from a technology person, but start with your business process. You can take an incredibly terrible business process and put a wonderful technology on top of it and turn it into a really expensive, terrible business process if you're not careful. So you always have to be mindful of that.
What had terrified me when large language models first became a household topic is we began to deploy them and almost immediately understood them to hallucinate in ways that also made up source provenance and the underlying sources that it was technically citing. And there's example after example of this in nearly every industry. And I think that just more directly to supply chains, we need to be careful about how we deploy that technology and how we ultimately war room using breaking technologies. I think a lot, Brian, to your point earlier about data, and even at an analyst level, it's so important to have a human in the loop. We're not automating our global ecosystems out with any of the technologies that exist around blockchain or IoT or AI or others. Final trivia question. We have about 14 minutes left. Before we jump into this one, I do want to take a few seconds and thank Candorful for everything they've been able to do through their mission, particularly as we arrive against Veterans Day. And again, a happy Veterans Day to all those military members on the line, military spouses, transitioning military. Candorful has been able to help, I believe, over 4,000 candidates to date. And so if there are any capable folks on the line of making a donation, it would be very greatly appreciated. With that said, a donation potentially back to the participants is trivia question number 3. This is calling all MBA nerds. And the question is, what game was created as a simulation to help people experience supply chain problems by Jay Forrester at MIT in the 1960s? Excellent answers in the chat. It was indeed the beer game, or the beer distribution game. Jen, Exiger is a SaaS company, and so a lot of what we do is around technology and the technology that exists to support the physical movement of goods, or perhaps how software is composed through individual binaries, the zeros and ones that make that software run. How do you use technology, and how do you help some of your Fortune 500 customers leverage technology in their data-driven decisions? How do you separate the wheat from the chaff? How do you reduce noise into actionable intelligence? Because I would imagine as we continuously explore technology, we can find false positives everywhere that can drive, to an earlier comment Brian made, analysis paralysis. What do we do to solve for some of these issues?
Sure. We start at the beginning, we need to know what risks concern them the most, right? And we need to level set on what their risk tolerance is and what types of risks they want to see. They all want real-time data, right? And having been an investigator, having been the person gathering all that data, I want real-time data all day, every day. And then I'll figure out how to make use of it. So our goal is to give them real-time, really curated data that we help risk assess, right? So 1 to 10, I'm going to tell you what are the 9s and 10s that you need to put a resource on to figure out, validate, and figure out if it's going to drive you to a decision point. One of the most exciting things we're doing now is clients want the ability to do scenario analysis, right? They want to look at, I think this is coming. Let's look at my supply base. Let's look at, if this happens, what are alternatives for me? Not maybe alternatives now, maybe alternatives in the future. So they need the ability to have war room discussions internally and with their suppliers. They need the ability to do that alternative analysis and to invest, right? And to root out single source suppliers or find additional, baking in additional bandwidth and capacity so that there isn't total disruption to their supply base. We have found that when we do illuminations, whether it's on a program or a product or sector of the market, we're giving them so many more insights deep into their supply base than they've ever had before. And, on the defense side of the house, we're seeing really stringent government requirements flow out where it's no longer a nice to have. The requirements say, okay, prime suppliers, vendors, you have to map all of them and you have to monitor it and you have to roll up data and give that to me and show me what you're doing about it, what you think the likelihood is about it and what the impact's going to be. So, there's so many different things we can do. We meet each client where they're at. Our goal is to help move them from a totally reactive to a predictive state. And the advancements where you can see risk insights and map your supply base, not only for your current industry, but see it across markets and industries. Again, it's driving really strategic decision-making on how you invest in suppliers, in materials, in capability in different ways that's moving them past kind of the here and now to what do I need to be doing in the future, right? In near term and how do I accomplish that? So really exciting advancements and, I'm a huge tech proponent. So I think that real-time insight is really critical to see that maturity.
That's great. Yeah, it strikes me that the U.S. military is probably a logistics operation first and foremost in order to ensure continuity of supply to our warfighter. Brian, given 30 years of experience across various logistics in the military, what type of unique skills can veterans transitioning military members and various spouses bring to the table as they look to the private sector?
Yeah, it's a great question, and there's a lot of different facets to that, but I'm gonna cover just a couple, and they may not be, it's not the usual leadership 101 type answer you're gonna get, but one of the things that personnel in the military are very used to is following the commander's intent and operating with what we call disciplined initiative to achieve whatever those goals are. So changing that from Army speak into my civilian sector job, what my boss finds interesting, I find fascinating, right? And if he just tells me the three parts of a commander's intent is purpose, key task, and end state. If he tells me the purpose of what we're doing, some of the big rocks he thinks we need to hit along the way, and what it's supposed to look like in the end, then I can go out and I can do those things that fill in all the details that make it happen. And that is something that many, many, many service members are very used to doing. We're used to following the lead of the person in front of us that's giving the directions, but doing it in a way where we don't have to come back all the time for guidance, right? Now, if you run into a stumbling block, sure, you learn to check back in. But that disciplined initiative to take what the boss wants to get done and work within your authority is a skill set that I think officers and NCOs excel at. And so maybe not a common answer that you would be used to, but it is something that the military brings to bear that maybe people don't think of quite so often. When it comes to supply chain, the Army's going to give you all the basics. You're going to learn, issue, store, and receive are the same no matter what kind of warehouse you're running. Finding efficient distribution routes, avoiding obstacles, those are things you're going to do, and the Army's going to train you that. The civilian world's going to train you that. I think some of the other intangibles are the additional pieces that our military members can bring. And then, there's a no-fail mindset. Somebody else, I think Eric said that earlier, right? It starts at a very young age. And honestly, at 23 years old, I had 30 to 40 soldiers with 5 direct subordinates. My very first job coming out of college, right? That is a leadership lab that is hard to match anyplace else. And if you stick around long enough, you're bound to learn how to do what's right and make a few mistakes along the way that you'll also learn from. And, I definitely know that I did. And the last thing I want to say about what the military brings is it brings a very educated workforce to you at every level. So every officer and every non-commissioned officer and every soldier really every couple years goes through schooling. I added it up, and in my 30 years, the Army sent me for 125 weeks of education. And I'm not talking about, military training. I'm talking about education in leadership. I'm talking about education in supply chain management. I'm talking about education in planning. And so we have a very deliberate path. I don't know any other industry where people get that much education in a career. On top of that, between all the avenues, the Army, just about every NCO and every officer, especially if they made mid-grade, has a bachelor's or at least, and generally a master's as they make mid-grade. So you're going to get a very educated, both by academia and through the military, personnel that have a very focused way of looking at things. They can help any organization. They'll bring a work ethic, and I think those of you that have worked with military know sometimes we can be forceful. I won't lie about that, but we come with a very driven and passionate way of doing things, and it all stems from that passion that started with service so many years before. And so, working with discipline initiative, well educated, and definitely worked in a leadership laboratory where when you put them in front of other people, they're not likely to be nervous off the bat. They're probably going to have a plan, or at least act like they have a plan from the get-go. So there are others in this room that probably can add on to that. So I'll shut up and leave them some time as well.
It's a great piece of advice. Jen first, and then Eric. For veterans or service members that are considering a career in supply chain, what's a quick piece of advice that you'd offer them to help succeed?
Yes, first off, come join us. It's an incredible industry. It's fast-paced, it's dynamic. For life learners out there, every day is different. You're going to learn and grow, and there's such a vast variety of roles to support supply chain, whether you're on the tech side, whether you're on the government side, whether you're on industry, commercial, the DIB, right? There's so many opportunities. And the coolest thing is, for those of you, I know you all love to serve your country. Supply chain is about serving our country, right? Whether it's national security, securing our national security, economic security, right? Everything we live on day to day comes from a supply chain. So you will feel so connected to the continued mission and service, right? I thought when I left the military, it was going to be like, oh my gosh, I'm going to lose my family. I'm going to lose my connection. And 24 years in, and I still feel so connected to the warfighter and to the mission. So yes, reach out to us. We'd love to chat with you. We love to work with Candorful to continue to help you in your transition and help you find the right fit. Thank you.
Eric, last words of advice for perhaps those.
Yeah, kind of as Jennifer and Brian brought up, that there's a lot of areas that you could go into. And I think a lot of it is, the difference is when you're in the military, you get put somewhere because you have to be there, because you've been told to be there. Now you have the opportunity to figure out where you might want to be. And, I tell the same thing to my MBAs when when we do a lot of interviews at Penn State to prep them. I tell people to reverse it. And what I mean by that is it's always very easy for someone to come up with what they don't want to do versus with what they do want to do. So when you start looking at what might be a good fit for you, just come up with a list of what you don't like. And that'll help guide you for there's a ton of positions within supply chain that are out there. Normally what I see is you'll see a lot of people that are in military, they'll go into they go into some form of operations. And although that is incredibly satisfying and I've done a lot of it, you have to look also and be mindful of two things. One is, your career for where you're going with that potential. And the other is, what is your earning potential in that particular position? And so I joke, I have a friend that calls me literally every 6 months from Maersk, and he keeps trying to get me to come back and do strange and unusual logistics in Africa, because it's what I used to do. And I give him a hard time because he's like, you're one of 5 guys I know that knows how to do this stuff on the planet. And I'm like, yeah, but what kind of career is that when you're done? So I think a lot of it too is, we gravitate because it's who we are to the strange and crazy stuff. Just because of what we've lived with our entire lives. But you kind of have to look at, now that you're out of the military, what kind of life do you want to have, and kind of balance that is probably the best advice I could give.
I think Jen would say working with me is a bit strange and crazy at times with what I whip up in my innovation shop. So I do agree that there's a bit something for everyone. We're right up at time. So first and foremost, Brian, Eric, Jen, I want to thank you for your time tonight. For the dozens and dozens of people on the call, thank you so much for spending an hour with us. We, Brian, Eric, Jen, myself, we're all on LinkedIn. Please reach out. Happy to have individual chats with you as well. But with that said, to the veterans on the line, happy Veterans Day. And Pat, back over to you.
Thank you so much, Skyler. I really appreciate it. You did a great job. So Skyler is our first time using a non-internal, to some degree, Candorful moderator, and you did an awesome job. Thank you so much. You guys just totally rock. Before I talk through the Trivia Prize answers and winners, I want to thank the panelists. Such a good experience. I learned about supply chain firsthand at PRTM way back a long time ago. So if any of my PRTM friends are on the call, this brings back great memories. But I wanted to thank Jen, Nestor, and Skyler Chi of Exiger for your efforts tonight. Awesome. Brian Memoli and Eric Top, Brian Memoli from Gemaire and Eric Top from Amazon. Thank you so much for spending the time preparing for this, putting up with all my emails. Thank you for all you've done and for the support you've given. Again, for one last time, I want to thank our platinum sponsor, Booz Allen Hamilton, our silver sponsors, Groundswell and Exiger, and our continuing contributor, Amazon. You guys are what make it so we can do what we do and keep it free for veterans, transitioning military, and military spouses. All right, let's get down to the Trivia Prize winners, and then we can all go eat dinner. All right, so walking through this, the first question, which was my favorite question of the night, I think, maybe number 3 was, I don't know, maybe number 2 was, Settlers of Catan. I can't tell you the number of times I've gotten mad at my family playing Settlers of Catan, but that is the answer to the competitive board game where we talk resources and roads. Shout out to my daughter and her husband for introducing me to that game. The winner of that is Frederick Schmidt. So I'll be in contact to get you your Yeti mug. Question number 2, the term supply chain management was coined in 1982 by Keith Oliver, a consultant at, of course, Booz Allen Hamilton. It became popularized in the mid-1990s. So that's another great one. And then lastly, near and dear to my heart, an MIT question, the beer game was a result of Jay Forrester's work on system dynamics. I apologize, I left the winner off. It was Curtis Little Haley Mayer or Mahar for the Booz Allen Hamilton. And then for the beer game, it was my good friend Eric Silverman, but Curtis Little right on his tail. So Curtis Little, you're going to get the Candorful mug. So you guys watch for an email from me. Have a wonderful Veterans Day. Thank you so much to our sponsors and our speakers. And thank you to all of the veterans who have helped keep our wonderful country safe and secure, and have a happy Veterans Day, everyone. Good night.